Growing up during the 2000s was great because it was a particularly amazing time to be a gamer. It was that sweet spot where the PS2, Xbox, and GameCube matured, which wildly expanded the scope and scale of video games, but the internet was still coming into its own as well, which meant that devs weren't shoving DLC down our throats every chance they got, nor were they releasing unfinished games with the knowledge that they could just update it later, at least not for the most part. There was just something amazing about playing a game to unlock items instead of having to buy them. But possibly my favorite part about that time period was that all games didn't have to be these wildly expensive productions to have a good chance at succeeding. Therefore, we got a lot of really good, yet relatively small or unknown games that you don't see much of today, and that's a touch that I miss. So because I'm feeling extra nostalgic, today I'm going to be talking about 5 video game series I think should make a comeback. Most of you will be familiar with 1 or 2 of these, but the others probably didn't get the recognition they deserved.
Now, I'm going to tear you limb from limb!
I'm going to kick this off with the Budokai/Tenkaichi series. I separated these because you have the Dragon Ball Z Budokai games, the Budokai Tenkaichi games, and then just Ultimate Tenkaichi by itself, which dropped in 2011. These games literally made my life better as a child and were probably responsible for more than a few broken controllers at the same time. Regardless, I'm not just talking about one of these iterations making a return. I'm talking about a combination of elements from multiple versions combined into one and released on the current hardware. My life would be complete. My first experience with this series was playing Budokai 1 as a kid when I got the PlayStation 2 for my birthday, and just to give you an idea of how epic that was to experience, these are the kind of graphics and presentation I was used to before I got Budokai, and this was the upgrade. I could not get enough of DBZ back then, and Budokai's epic retelling of the story through somewhat show-accurate animated cutscenes damn near had me foaming at the mouth. My other favorite from the standalone Budokai series was number 3. By then, they'd done away with the cutscenes, but being able to fly around in the Dragon universe and experience the story from different character perspectives was refreshing. Not to mention I love the fighting mechanics in that game as well. Then once you got into the Tenkaichi series, I was in love with number 2 and being able to play with an expansive roster of characters, and the story was very comprehensive as well. But in terms of bringing this series back onto the new hardware, I'm gonna say they'd have an opportunity to make the greatest DBZ game ever created. None of these games by themselves were perfect, but combining elements from each with the power of these systems would surpass anything they've done to date. Especially now that the years have passed and DB Super has aired, that leaves room to expand the character list even further. I've never been a fan of the Xenoverse series, and although I do understand they were just trying something new, I don't think anybody would object to something like Tenkaichi 2 on modern hardware. On a side note, Burst Limit was actually my favorite to release on the PS3, so I could even live with something similar to that. Next, I'm going with the MotorStorm series, and I honestly don't have a good idea of who missed out on this and who didn't. I remember a copy of MotorStorm Pacific Rift, the second game in the series, coming bundled with the 80GB PS3s back around 2008, so maybe it's made its way into a good amount of households, I don't know. Either way, easily one of my favorite series on the PlayStation 3. The graphics were amazing for its time, which was the first thing that drew me in, and it was just a unique racer compared to a lot of the other stuff I used to play. You could race in vehicles spanning from relatively normal cars to ATVs, and how the different parts on the maps affected your car really made it entertaining. 1 minute your motor could be overheating, so then you've got to find a water spot to cool yourself down. There was just a lot of different challenges other than trying to finish in first. But specifically, MotorStorm Apocalypse, which was the third and final game to release on the PS3, is the style that I would especially love to see them take onto the current gen hardware. As the name implies, while you're driving, the world was constantly falling apart around you, which led to really awesome and challenging races, and maps that were constantly shifting as the game wore on. A path you took on the last lap might be breaking away the next time around, so it was just very dynamic. This looked amazing on the PS3 back in 2011, so I can't even begin to imagine how they could expand on this type of idea with a more capable console. Not only would the environments look amazing, but that shifting mechanic would work even better. The last sign of MotorStorm was a PlayStation Network title that I never even knew existed called MotorStorm RC, which is significantly different from the originals. Evolution Studios probably had a chance to make a fourth MotorStorm title, but they decided to go with Drive Club instead, and then the studios were closed. MotorStorm was an amazing, unique racing game, and there is a title for the PS4 called Onrush, which looks like MotorStorm reincarnated kind of, but I'm never truly going to be satisfied without the real thing.
Dude, that was an insane amount of surgery. I can't even believe you're alive. But yo, they fixed you up good. Look at you, man. You are good as new.
We should all be able to agree in unison that the Skate series should be on modern consoles. Early on in 2017, an engagement executive for EA tweeted out #Skate4, only for the CEO to come out a few days later and say they hadn't actually been working on it. But that doesn't rule it out forever, especially since the game was received well by fans. I discovered Skate a few months after it came out back in 2007, and I didn't actually have the game, I was just hooked on the demo. That's how much fun I was having. I got a real copy a couple of months later, and it was one of my favorite skating games of all time. I spent my early childhood with the Tony Hawk series, and then I really didn't bother with the genre for a while until this came out. This was another title that was super good looking for its time, and more importantly, it was just flat out fun. Participating in events trying to build a name for yourself, running away from security guards, trying to crush as many of your fragile bones as possible, none of this really ever got old. They produced a second and a third, so the only logical assumption was that they'd carry right on to the new consoles. As of now, that's just floating out there in the ether, but I still have hope that they'll give us at least one more of these games. Hell, I'd even take a remaster of the first one at this point, considering we're getting kind of late in these consoles' life cycles. For number 2, one of my favorite games of all time, and I have the receipts to back this one up later, Warhawk. So there was a related game for the PlayStation 1 called Starhawk, which I didn't play, but then another was developed as one of the earliest PlayStation 3 games, and if you didn't experience it in its prime, well, I'm sorry. The title was groundbreaking in many ways, because in a time where online gaming hadn't completely taken over the world yet, Warhawk was crafted as an all-online experience, meaning no story mode. That probably made retro gamers a little bit salty, and normally I would agree, but this time I promise it was worth it. It was an all-out war game where you battle on foot, in air, in trucks, or in tanks. The maps were big and gorgeous, and in games with up to 32 players, you really got the sense that you were taking part in this full-scale battle. The great thing was that each map had a variation to it. If you were on a 32-person server, all of the map would normally be accessible. But in smaller games, you'd usually find that the same maps had places you couldn't go, which was appropriate because otherwise you'd only have a small number of people scattered around these really large maps, which would take away from the action. With that feature, every time you hopped into a game, you experienced it exactly the way the devs intended. Fast-paced, all-out chaos. The fact that you could immediately take an on-foot gun battle into artillery or into the air just added to the excitement. The best way I could describe it is an arcade version of Battlefield. So they were able to accomplish all this very early on in the PlayStation 3's life cycle. On the PS4, they'd simply be able to expand on everything they created here, especially because it's no big surprise now for a game to be only multiplayer. To me, that means it fit right into the culture. Bigger and better looking maps, more players in each games, and more impressive visuals to add to the experience. The main reason I'd like to see a PS4 version though is because, it hurts my heart to say, but Warhawk is finally coming to an end. This is an online only game whose servers have been up since April of 2007. Just last month, Sony announced that they're finally shutting the servers off. It was supposed to be done on October 25th, but because of some legal issues, they're actually not doing away with it until January 31st of 2019. The receipts I was talking about earlier was the fact that this is one of the only games I've never stopped playing, and I'm not exaggerating. The matches are quick, fast-paced, and they do capture the flag better than many other games, so I've always found the time to turn it on and play a game or two at least once a month for the last 11 years. No game in my life has kept me interested enough to consistently play it past its expiration date. And Warhawk still has a large enough community that the news of the server shutdown sparked an entire petition to keep them on. Everyone can be nostalgic about a game and claim it was amazing, but there's no truer test of that love than how many people actually play the games they speak of. I still do my part in tweeting the director every year begging him to spark a movement to bring the game to the PS4, but so far I'm failing miserably.
Remember me?
I remember you. You're the cop, and I'm the guy who said I'd find you.
And finally, the last series, which will forever hold a place in my heart, the Driver series. It wouldn't be untrue to say that this series sparked the beginning of my love for video games. The first one dropped in 1999, and the gist of it was that you're an undercover cop named John Tanner who's being tasked with infiltrating a crime syndicate. More or less, the first 3 games of the series are based around that premise, but what really got people interested for the time was its style. Driver, as the name implies, was simply a great driving game. It included a lot of Hollywood-style police chases, but there's 2 elements that eventually failed to carry the series to its full potential. First, the rivalry they created between Tanner and the main criminal Jericho was incredible. Ubisoft did this with great storytelling and interesting character personalities, but mainly the cutscenes that I always felt were ahead of their time. The problem was that as the years passed, it felt like the cinematics were the only thing carrying the game. Driver 2 introduced new mechanics like getting out of the car, which they completely botched, and then they did the same thing with Driver 3, which became a huge problem. Basically, they lost their identity by trying to compete with GTA, which was taking over at the time, and their on-foot action, even once they added guns, was just fucking terrible and couldn't hold a candlestick to GTA. But as a kid, I was so infatuated with the story, the cutscenes, and my overall love for the driving portion that I was just too distracted to acknowledge what an incomplete game it had become. However, their worst mistake with this series, and the reason why I actually think it should come back, came when they continued Tanner and Jericho's story 7 years later in Driver San Francisco. Driver 3 was the last game these characters appeared in, and in between, they released Driver Parallel Lines, which had nothing to do with the 3 previous games. When San Francisco came out, a lot of the original design team had moved on, and Ubisoft was trying to revive a series that did have potential. Their goal was to eliminate the on-foot portion and go back to the roots of the series, which was all about driving. They did that, but they totally lost me and probably a lot of original fans with 2 mistakes. 1. The gameplay still managed to completely change with this feature where Tanner could basically warp into any car on the map because he was in a coma. And that was fun, but it made it literally impossible for the story or a game to feel authentic to original fans. And that's the most important part. Their main characters seemed as if they'd come from 2 different universes. Check out Tanner and Jericho's characters in the original Driver games compared to what they did in San Francisco.
And every known hitman in Miami's asking for you. 3 hours later, you're walking right down the middle of Collins Avenue, tight with Tico's gang. You cut a deal, Bacchus, but you're not gonna give them back their V8. I am.
You want me to back up Lomez?
No. The cops got nowhere to go. You ever been to Turkey?
Let's see, you have, right? That wouldn't be you who put drainage in Naz's skull.
A misunderstanding over dinner.
Miss me?
A few hours ago, I would have driven us both into a wall if there was a chance it would kill you.
Why'd they change your heart? Your balls drop off?
They literally turned them both from these hard-nosed badasses competing against each other into, well, complete fucking jokes if we're being honest. How did Jericho go from this calm, calculated, and methodical criminal into an old angry Scooby-Doo villain? They didn't even look remotely the same, and they failed to establish a timeline between this and Driver 3 to explain these changes. None of that original tension was there, and they completely failed to carry the weight of their stories into what was supposed to be this epic conclusion. If Jericho and Tanner had been a part of titles that hadn't completely lost their gameplay identities or story elements, I honestly believe they would have went down in history as some of people's favorite video game characters. I would love to see their stories be rebooted with modern gaming because, in a way, this franchise was a bit ahead of its time. As I mentioned at the beginning, games are now these massive productions with stories that sometimes rival full-on films. That's exactly what Driver was becoming in an era where that wasn't quite as prominent. With great gameplay to go along with that element, which would be well accepted today, I'm sure Driver would fit right in. And that about does it for this topic. Those are the 5 video game series that I would love to see make a return. As many of you know who follow this channel, this was my first official swing at doing a video for some different games. I started this channel over a year ago with the intention of it being a full-on gaming channel, which is why my banner has so many different gaming characters in it. And because of school and the other channel, I just never got around to it, never had time. So it will still be primarily 2K here, because that's simply the game I play the most and the content comes easiest there. However, I do want to start playing some different games here, and I want people to be used to watching me play some different things on Twitch as well. Again, 2K is always going to be the overwhelming majority, but if you enjoy this type of thing as well, make sure to show support, and I'll make sure to keep dropping them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.